Hello, I'm Morgan Peckman, Executive Director of New York Civic, and this is Candidate College. In this episode of Candidate College, we take you through the often difficult process of petitioning. Some critics say that petitioning is a deliberately arcane and complicated process used to keep candidates like yourself off the ballot. Well, our two petitioning experts, Republican Lynn Crow and Democrat Robert Carroll, dispute that notion. Over the next hour, we'll take you through the process of petitioning, all the way from collecting signatures to the best time to submit them. I hope we answer all your questions about this difficult process.
Not many people actually have read through a petition, even ones who've carried them before, actually look at it and go and understand what the document really is. You know, it's witnessing and standing up for someone who you believe should be a candidate for office. And as a holder, you're witnessing all of these people who are also standing up for the candidate. And I think that's important to remember when you're actually signing a petition or when you're carrying it. This isn't just, you know, a pain in the butt mechanism to get your candidate on the ballot, which it is. But it's a very, and as I said, it's archaic. It's a very specific way, and it's a specific way to stand up for your candidate and say, this person deserves to be on the ballot, and here's why.
Petitioning should be thought of not just as a chore to get on the ballot. It should be the first foray into large canvassing operations for your campaign. This is the first time, probably, that you'll have many volunteers going out knocking on doors every night. It'll be the first time maybe that the candidate is every night knocking on doors with a volunteer. And this is very important. And this is one of the reasons why I like the petitioning process. A lot of people will say that the petitioning process is antiquated and should be changed. But it's actually, in many ways, it's very democratic. It forces candidates and campaigns to knock on the doors of the citizens who live in that district and ask them to sign a piece of paper so that they can get on the ballot. And I think that's part of active democracy.
I don't think it's accurate to say that petitioning is to prevent new people from getting on the ballot. What I do think is that it's a system that's so arcane and archaic that it, at some level, just makes it difficult for new people to get involved.
I think the first and most important thing is when you get a list of your volunteers, people are going to go out and petition for you. You need to make sure those volunteers are registered voters. And so if you're running in the Democratic primary, getting on the Democratic line, you're going to need to make sure that every single one of those voters is a registered Democrat. And as you check that, as you go through each person, you should also be checking what their name is as they are registered. So if everyone calls me, for instance, Bobby, but of course I'm registered as Robert C. Carroll. So when I'm going and collecting petitions, in the statement of witness, I will always write Robert C. Carroll. It is always your full name, the name that you are registered with. And of course, you must look at the address and make sure that the address is the address that that person lives at, is also registered at. So I live at 26A Windsor Place. I would write out 26A Windsor Place, not 26.5 Windsor Place or 26 Windsor Place, but 26A Windsor Place. So that's the first and most important thing, is to make sure that the people who are going to carry your petition are registered, that they're registered in the party that you are carrying that petition for, and that you know what name they are registered under and the exact address that they are registered under. All they have to do is follow a few simple rules. So when they knock on Mary's door at 123 First Street, they should say, I am, John. I am here for so-and-so candidate. Would you please sign his designating petition so that he can get on the ballot in September or maybe now June? After the person says yes, you fill out the date, whatever the date is, and when you fill out the date, if it's petitioning used to be in June usually, you would write June 11th. You would never write 6. You write June because no one can ever mistake June for something else. June is always June. Then you write 6. Then you would ask, that petition would ask Mary to sign her full name, which is very important. Now, this may sound a little antiquated, but for some older women, they might still sign Mrs. John Jones instead of Mary Jones. But that happens very rarely anymore. And the most important thing is for her to sign Mary Jones, if that's the name she is registered under. She should not use any prefixes, no Miss, Mr., Doctor, etc., just your name. And then you should take the petition back from that person, and you should fill in their address. If you're going door to door with a walk list of registered Democrats, you will know the address, so it's 123 First Street. If you do not, if you're on a subway platform or at a street fair or at a supermarket, just simply ask Mary Jones, where do you live? And so if she says 123 First Street, I would say repeat that back to her, 123 First Street, to make sure that you've gotten the address correctly. Also, no abbreviations. I do not abbreviate on my petition. So 123 First Street. You could do a 1 and an ST, or you could spell out first, F-I-R-S-T, and then I would spell out street. And I would spell out anything you possibly can. Now, of course, every once in a while, if you're up in Greenpoint and you have somebody on McGinnis Boulevard, and they live at 1020 McGinnis Boulevard, it's a lot of letters. And so they might not be able to do it. So they might have to abbreviate Boulevard. But the reason why I say for people not to abbreviate or to use shorthand is because there are lots of instances for streets and addresses that we use colloquial phrases for them that aren't their real addresses. So I grew up in Windsor Terrace, Brooklyn, and the main shopping drag there is 9th Avenue. But of course, the real name is Prospect Park West. But if you've lived there a long time, you call it 9th Avenue. If you grew up in Bay Ridge, people know that 69th Street and 75th Street are actually Bay Ridge Avenue and Bay Ridge Parkway. So we want to get into the habit of using the proper addresses and to write them out, because also, of course, you were never going to mistake. I had a good example once where East 5th Street looked like 85th Street or something. And because they put an E and a 5 and they were very, very close together. And so when you write things out, they're much, much clearer. And the reason why the petitioner should write it out is because if John, who had gone out petitioning, comes back and we're not sure of what the address is or it's illegible and we want to make him make it clearer, which we will of course initial after he does that, we want for him, he will be able to read his own handwriting much better than he would have been able to read somebody's handwriting on the street or door to door. You do not need zip codes, nor do you need apartment numbers. Apartment numbers are not a bad thing. They're not, if it happens, it's okay. Zip codes are totally unnecessary, and they should not be on the petition.
You should always collect way more signatures than the minimum amount required, at least 3 times. That's the general rule of thumb, 3 times the minimum required number of signatures. That's because a lot of your signatures will get knocked off if you get challenged, and that's why it's really important to protect yourself with a big buffer of signatures.
The biggest mistake a candidate can make is not getting enough signatures on the, when it comes to petitioning. The second biggest mistake is not taking a voter list and going to that household and making sure that the person who's signing your petition is actually the person you're looking to have sign your petition. What I often see problematic is for candidates to go to the door, talk to them about the race, and they end up signing, and then you go back and you can't figure out who it was. You have no idea, where they were because they didn't put their address down because you said you'd fill it out later. And all of these mistakes that, frankly, at the time you think are harmless and I just got the signature, it's not a problem. Be as accurate as you can. You can talk to them about your race and your candidacy. Just make sure the volunteer you have with you is getting all of their accurate information and they're checking it off on your voter registration piece of paper that you bring along with you.
The first and biggest error that a candidate can have is just an error on what office they're running for, what their address is, their name. People make foolish errors. People, don't proofread things. You need to proofread. I don't consider myself the greatest proofreader in the world, And so what I do is I read the petition out loud. And then I have somebody else following along with me, because it's important. You should also, you don't want to be penny wise and pound foolish. If you haven't done this before, if you don't have somebody who has done this before, you should be going to a professional printing company and have them print your petitions. And you still are going to need to prove that. I've had professional printing companies misspell Brooklyn, misspell candidates' names, misspell all types of things. And they always send you a proof before they print them, and you approve it. You need to read every line.
It's important to have someone, in my opinion, whether it's an election law attorney or someone who is well-versed in the petitioning process in New York, on your team, paid or unpaid. Do not sign a petition. Do not witness. Stay out of it. And the reason's very simple. Because you're held to a higher standard as a candidate, you need to be very careful. And that goes for any candidate at any level, period.
The candidate should never be the person who is reviewing petitions or training people on how to petition. And this is the same reason why, for most candidates, I would suggest that they do not carry their own petition. Because you never want to be in a situation as a candidate where you're either carrying your own petition, which means you are actually physically witnessing it. You are the statement of witness. It doesn't mean you can't be standing next to John or Jane and see them gathering a petition. But they should not be physically gathering those signatures and being a statement of witness, nor should they be reviewing or teaching people how to gather petitions or looking over someone's petitions after they've gone out on a night of door knocking to gather those petitions. And the reason why is because we do not want there to be even a suggestion of fraud from the candidate. Now, I'm not suggesting that any of you or any other candidate goes out there looking to commit fraud, but we would not want a time where a very simple thing would be somebody has crossed out a box on a petition that we have right here. So someone has crossed out a signature line. Very simply, there was a wrong name, or somebody made a mistake and it was crossed out, and they moved to the next line. And now John, petitioner, has come back and filed his petitions for the night with the campaign. And the candidate sees that he crossed the box out but did not initial it, which you should always do and we'll talk about later. And the candidate decides to initial it. Totally innocuous, you might think, and he's thinking to do something that he thinks is right and was told is what you should do. Of course, this isn't his petition. He didn't cross it out. He did not witness it. That would be considered fraud. Would that get you knocked off the ballot? Probably not. But you don't want to risk these things, nor do you want to risk a candidate teaching someone how to petition. And then you have an incident where somebody brings you to court suggesting that your petitions are permeated with fraud, and a volunteer, a well-intentioned volunteer, reiterates something that suggests that the candidate was telling volunteers to go and gather petitions in an incorrect way. So that's why I suggest not for a candidate not only not to gather his own signatures, but never to review or to teach people how to gather petitions.
I'm always looking to make sure that they're not afraid to talk to people. Someone who is a little more timid, who's quiet, who really isn't necessarily social, super social, have them in the office working to input the petitions, working to go through the petitions, to double check addresses, to double check signatures, etc. That's my suggestion for someone who's outgoing, who doesn't mind talking to people, who has no problem cold knocking on a door. That's the person you want with you. You also want someone who's involved, civically, who's involved in the community, who knows people already. They're already predisposed.
Petitions don't need to be printed professionally. I have printed on a laser jet printer petitions, single petitions. You just need to, most single petitions will fit on a legal size piece of paper, so 14 by 8.5 by 14 inches. However, printing petitions with a with a professional printer, someone who does this often. And there's only a few companies. Two of them that come to mind are Astoria Graphics and Progress Printing, but there are a handful of them that do this. And the reason why it's important is that the people who set up these templates do this very, very often. And they are not likely to make a mistake in the sense of they're going to make sure that the legal language on the document is correct, to make sure that the format is correct, and to make sure that the spacing, so that the petition is easy to write in, which is very important. And most professional printers will ask you one question, and that will be, do you want a 1-box or 2-box petition? And you only need a 1-box petition, because the law is that all you need is the signed name and then the date and address. Now, a lot of people like 2-box petitions, and it's actually a great reform. Most people who, the Kings County Democrats will always use a 1-box petition. They will never use a 2-box petition. And the reason why, and they won't tell you this, the reason why is because they're harder to challenge. And the reason why they're harder to challenge is because a signature can be illegible. And so it's very hard to look up that person on a voter file. But of course, if a printed name is there, it's easier to find that person. Now, of course, you can also use the address. But if you have an apartment building or multiple people living at that address, it's hard to tell whose signature that really is. But the reason why I would suggest using a 2-box petition, even though they're more easily challenged, is because you will know the person's name. And you will know that Mary Smith and John Smith signed your petition. And if you're running a good campaign, and you actually want to represent the people who live in your district, you're going to want to contact those people. You're going to want to let them know, thank them for for signing your petition. You're going to want to knock on their doors as the campaign progresses. So even though county and some of the large political clubs and organizations in New York City only use a 1-box petition, I would say you should use a 2-box petition.
If you're a candidate who's not necessarily backed by a member of the party, there are a couple different ways to do it. One, hire for the cheap an electional attorney who will take 5 minutes and look over your document, and you can give them $100. Easy. Two, if you have no other option than to look at other petitions, get the most recent petition you can get your hands on from the Board of Elections. They have to give them to you. They have to give you something. Even go with one that, possibly is that the current person you're running against in potentially a primary, that the county committee's backing, go look at one of their former petitions if they've run before. The other suggestion I have is there are organizations out there that are, young Republicans, college Republicans. They all hold petitions. They've seen petitions before. Many of those organizations have their own attorneys and general counsels. You can ask them to help you. So there are different ways you can find someone but again, you need some sort of lawyer to look at these petitions before you go forward, or who knows what you could be signing.
When they send a proof back, I read aloud every word on the petition. And I have somebody there sitting with an old copy of a petition that I know is accurate for all the legal language, because that's what's important, that's on the document, to make sure that that's all correct. And I then double and triple check the names and addresses that appear on that petition, the candidate or candidates, and those people who are part of the committee to fill vacancies. In case something happens to you as the candidate, you are incapacitated, you pass away, or you decide not to run for some reason, but you've already filed petitions. You have designated a committee to fill vacancies, to put somebody else in your place on the ballot. The first thing about a committee to fill vacancies is that you don't need one. It is not a requirement that you have one. The only thing that would happen is if you became incapacitated or fell ill, is that your name could be struck from the ballot. Or you would just stay there on the ballot and not be able to run a campaign. Too often people get caught up in wanting to show some type of gratitude or respect to someone by putting them on their committee to fill vacancies, but nobody ever notices it. The only time the committee to fill vacancies comes up in your petitioning process is sometimes a Someone who's likely to sign your petition asks the person who's carrying your petition, what are these names? And oftentimes the person has no idea. And then that never looks good. So to have this laundry list of names, I would suggest is a bad idea. Have 3 to 5 people, make sure they're registered, and be done with it.
Every petitioner should be armed with a clipboard, either black or blue pens. Red pens and pencils are not allowed. Many signature sheets, so if they're doing a great job collecting signatures, that they don't run out of space to get them. Some literature about the candidate so that people who are signing know at least who they're signing for. A map of the district, ideally, because some of these districts are really hard to find your way around, or it's not clear on what side of the street the district lies. And then if you're going door to door, you must have a walk list. A walk list tells you about the voters in that area, who's registered. If you're collecting signatures from one party or another, who's a Democrat, who's a Republican. A walk list is an absolute essential part of collecting signatures if you're going door to door.
Door-to-door signatures really are the best, and they're the best for 2 specific reasons. First, when you go to that person's door, you know that Mary Smith is a Democrat. You don't have to worry that she's not registered or registered in a different party. You also know that Mary Smith lives in the district, because you're only going to be knocking on doors in your district. And so this is really the 2 most important facts of when you're gathering, or the 2 most important criteria when you're gathering signatures. Is the person you're talking to a Democrat? And does that person live in the district? And by going door to door, you ensure those 2 factors. And then if you follow all of the other steps we've talked about specifically writing out the date, writing in the address, printing the name, following all those rules, you're going to ensure yourself that that signature counts, as long as you're the first person to gather that. Which is another caveat to the whole system, is that you must be the first person to receive that person's signature on your nominating petition for it to count towards your total. Now, the other way to gather signatures is called generally street signatures, which could mean going to a supermarket, standing on a subway platform, going outside of a church, anywhere, and gathering signatures. The one advantageous part of street signatures are that you can gather a lot in a short period of time. If you're at a busy subway station in the morning or at a busy supermarket, a lot of people will walk by you and a lot of people will sign, most likely. However, you're not going to know if they live in the district. You're not going to know if they're registered Democrats. You should always ask, are you a registered Democrat, before they sign. You should ask if they live in the district. A lot of times they won't know.
I do advise the targeting of signature collection. I think your local board of elections can get you a list, or your county party can get you a list of registered, Republicans, Independents, Democrats, Conservatives, and that list becomes your Bible. That you literally walk around with that, not just for voter identification as to whether or not they're partial to you and whether or not you think they'll vote for you down the road, but in terms of getting their signature, keeping in contact with them, knowing that they're predisposed and favorable. For me, the getting of the list is, those are the people you want to get to know. Those are the people you want to be involved in your campaign. And it's a quicker way of knowing who to talk to. There are ups and downs for both groups. For your volunteers, you've got people who either believe in the candidate, believe in the cause, are Republicans and have been doing it forever. You've got this core group of passionate people who like doing it, or who are so used to doing it that it's old hat for them. And so their incentive is, they love the candidate, they're related to the candidate, whatever that may be. Then you've also got the paid component, which is the folks who are paid to collect signatures. And, their incentive is obviously money, which is a great incentive, but their incentive is the, hourly rate to get paid to collect signatures. So both have incentives, both have negatives, but I think for me, I always, I'm a big believer in that grassroots element of a campaign. I do think it's the heart and soul of any campaign, and I go with, the volunteers every time.
You don't have to pay top dollar for some expensive office to run your petitioning operation. Ideally, you want to place in a centralized location in the district where you can deploy all your petitioners from. That's where your petitioning coordinator will stay. That's where you'll receive the petitions at the end of the day. Just a place where everything can be organized from.
It's definitely worthwhile to get as many signatures as you can to build your name ID in a cheap and very personal way, and at the same time to build your donor base and your volunteer base, etc. I think someone who has gotten that first voter touch from you via petition down the road will likely be predisposed to you, particularly in a city like New York or even statewide where we have a lot of people.
For every race, the Board of Elections assigns a petitioning period, and it's really important not to collect signatures before that petitioning period begins because all those signatures will be invalid. That being said, you need to be ready to start petitioning the day that petitioning begins. This isn't something that you can finish at the last minute like homework. This is an intricate, hard process. You need to have your team in place ready to start petitioning the second that the Board of Elections says go. Only the first time a person signs a petition is their signature valid. That makes petitioning a race because you want to make sure that you get someone's signature before your opponent does. And sometimes in smaller voter universes, like if you're a Republican in New York City and there are very few registered Republicans, those signatures are to be cherished and they're so difficult to find. And it's a race to find those rare Republicans to sign your petition.
I believe that the person carrying the petition should get as much information from the signer as possible, this person who would be signing the petition. Meaning that if they can sign their name and print their name and write out their address, that would be great. Because for me, when I'm looking to throw out an opponent's petition, I'm going to look at that first. I'm going to look at a petition paper and say, okay, clearly the witness filled in all of the addresses. Right? Let's make sure the addresses match. If the signature and the pen of the signature and the actual handwriting of the signature is the same as the address, I know that person who signed put their own address there. For me, as someone, again, it's ways to make sure that your petitions are bulletproof.
The only thing that the signer, the person who's going to be signing your petition, needs to do is physically sign it. Sign their legal name, the name that they're registered under. You, as the person gathering the signatures, can fill in everything else. Fill in the date, fill in the address, print their name if there's a box that allows you to do that. I always suggest that the person who is carrying the petition should fill in the date and fill out the full date, write out June or July, never abbreviate, fill out the full address and never abbreviate, and fill in their name, because it's more likely that you will not make a mistake. And it is more likely that your handwriting will be clearer, and if you are and you'll be accurate about what is going on. They should never allow someone to sign a petition that is out of their sight. And this happens a lot. People don't think when they're first hearing about petitioning, well, how could it get out of my sight? There are a lot of easy examples that happen all the time. I knock on Mary Smith's door, and she goes, I have a pen in the kitchen. And she grabs your clipboard and runs to her kitchen. And then she reappears, and the petition is signed. That's not okay. I know it sounds absurd. I know it seems overly doctrinaire, but it's not. You did not witness it. And you must witness every single signature. So if that happens to you, please ask Mary to cross her signature out, and please ask her to sign again. If she doesn't, don't argue with her, don't fight with her, just go to the next door. It's more important to do this properly than to get a large volume of signatures that are collected improperly. And the other most common example of someone seeing a petition that, or not accidentally not witnessing a signature, is at street fairs or block parties. Sometimes someone will set up a table or a booth somewhere to gather signatures, and they accidentally walk away, or they turn their back and talk to somebody they see, and suddenly signatures appear. Those are no good. I know that most people would say, well, why would somebody randomly walk up and sign a wrong name, or what's the matter with that? It's that you did not witness it. And again, it's witnessing it is the most important part of this process. All of these things can be fixed by crossing them out, and a single line. You want to show what you're crossing out. Because when someone is reviewing a petition, you don't want to suggest that you've blacked something out because something bad was underneath. We want to show all of our work. It's kind of like 5th grade math class. It's long division. You want to show everything you've done so no one thinks there are any questions about what you've done with your petitions.
Whenever you make a change on a petitioning line, when you're reviewing your petitions, or if you cross something out, it's always important to initial on both sides of the line. So if we're crossing out the signature, I'm putting my initials on both sides. And if I'm crossing out a bigger area, then I'm Xing out the entire area and I'm initialing in all 4 corners of that X. And that's to prove that it's me who has made these changes. And it's very important to always initial whenever you do something to alter your petition.
I don't believe you actually have to fill up an entire sheet of paper with 10 signatures or whatever your petition has on it available. I believe that if you go out for one Saturday and you collect 10 signatures, great. Witness it at the end of that day. I believe that, so if you look at your petition, you go out on a Friday night and you only get 2 signatures, make sure it's dated properly, make sure everything's great, sign it and witness it that day and put it away. Don't revisit it. When I see a petition that's got multiple dates on it, that my opponent has put together, I go right after it. I go right after it. And I look at where they walked. You know, I know the district just as well as they do, where they walked and why they walked that way and why they targeted those people. More paper makes it more confusing as well for someone who's looking to throw out your petition. The more paper, it makes it look more daunting. It makes it look, oh, this task is going to be crazy. How many signatures they have? It looks like there's 1,000 pieces of paper. There could only be 1 signature per paper. There's nothing illegal. There's nothing unethical. There's nothing wrong with that. It just makes it look more daunting for your opponents to try and toss out your petitions. When you're collecting signatures, don't fill out the state of witness prior to collecting the signatures. Absolutely not. That's bad. And you have to think of it, again, it's a legal document. I collected these signatures, I saw these people sign, and I'm going to witness that I saw these people sign. It needs to go in that order. And all of that information needs to be put into the petition prior to you witnessing it. Do not, and the other thing that is very important, if you're not sure about who those people were and where they live, don't witness it. You can be called to the stand. This is a legal document, and it's important.
A person should be registered where they live. That is the law. So if you have people, and especially in today's day and age, there are a lot of new young people in New York City and they move every year because of their apartments. If they're going out and petitioning for you, they should re-register at where they live, because that is what this says. It is saying, I, Robert Carroll, hereby state that I am a registered Democrat and live at this address, and I'm registered there. So it's not okay if I moved 6 months ago and go, okay, well, I'm just still registered there. Well, you don't live there anymore. So they should re-register. It takes 5 minutes. But as I was saying, any mistake here, no matter how innocuous it is, will invalidate the whole sheet.
When you're petitioning, you're out on the streets, going door to door, oftentimes walking in neighborhoods you're not familiar with. Inherently, there's some risk involved, and you should always be careful. And don't go into someone's house unless you feel really comfortable with them. You know, if someone isn't willing to come to their door and sign your petition, maybe you should just leave it at that. If you're the petitioning coordinator, or if you're running the petitioning operation, what you're going to do is give out sheets of petitions, ideally to your petitioners in the morning, so that they're going to go out all day collecting signatures. And at the end of the day, they'll bring back those sheets to you. And you really want to encourage people to come back at the end of every day. That way, your sheets aren't errant. The longer the sheets are out there, the less likely they are to come back. And you really need to make sure that you're tracking how many sheets you've given out to people, and so you get a sense of how many signatures are in play right now for your team, whether you need to have more people collecting signatures, whether you can pay fewer people to collect signatures if you have a paid petitioning operation. But it's really important that you have a centralized operation that moves like clockwork.
Generally, you want people coming back every night. So you have people come in who pick up some petitions and they go out that night and they bring them back. And when they bring them back, you go line by line. Make sure the dates are in sequence. Make sure that the addresses are filled out and they are filled out in full, so there are no unnecessary abbreviations. Make sure that if something was crossed out, if a line was crossed out because of a mistake, that the person who witnessed those signatures initialed on both sides. To make sure that if there are any empty boxes on a petition, so if somebody gets 6 signatures, that they cross out the rest and just make an X and then initial each point of the X. And the reason why we do that is because when you cross out, what you want to show is that I have now finished my sheet. I got 6 signatures. I'm crossing this out so that no one else can put a signature in. And I'm putting my number in. It's not against the rules to leave boxes blank and open, but it's sloppy. After that, you of course then go to the statement of witness that we talked about before. That person will have only filled in their name. So I would have Robert Carroll. I would then fill in my address, 26A Windsor Place, place written out, not PL. Then I would count up the amount of signatures I have, and I'd probably double count, even though you might go, it's 10, it's 10, it's 10. Always count twice so you don't make mistakes. I then fill in the date, always remembering to write June instead of the number 6, and etc. And then I would sign my name, and I would sign it as I sign a legal document. So I'd sign it Robert Carroll. And that's how, of course, I signed my voter registration card.
One particularly agonizing part of the petitioning process is data entry. Not only do you have to collect all those signatures, but you need to enter them into an Excel document so you can make sure if your signatures are valid, how many signatures you have, and then ultimately if you get into the challenging process, you'll have to take all your opponent's signatures and enter them into a computer too, so that you can mix and match and compare all of your petitions. So data entry is a very important and often forgotten part of the petitioning process.
There should be one person on your campaign who is charged with managing your petitioning process. That person should be hopefully training people and reviewing petitions and be very familiar with the petitioning process. That person should also know where the location of all your petitions are at any point, especially those that are completed. I would suggest that you should never have all of your petitions in one place. And the reason why is the Board of Elections does not care if you gathered 5,000 signatures. It cares how many you file. And so God forbid there's a fire, there's a break-in, somebody is, eating Chinese food or drinking a beer or a Coke and happens to spill it all on top of your petitions. Well, just because you got them doesn't mean they're filed, which means the Board of Elections doesn't care what happened to them. It's never happened to me in a campaign, but I've heard stories of people's cars being broken into, people's campaign offices being broken into because of that reason. Now, you don't need to go get a safety deposit box, but I would say it's smart that the person who's running your petitioning operation, put the petitions in maybe a secure place in their apartment, in a bureau, somewhere where they know they're not going to be lost or damaged. So you don't have suddenly 4,000 or 5,000 signatures lying around on top of a desk in some campaign office that, hundreds of people are traipsing through every day.
Bind it, put it all together, then number the pages. There are also fun things that we like to do. We start the first, 50 pages with full sheets. And then we stick in 100 more pages that just have one signature on them. It looks daunting when it's this big instead of this big. That stuff is great tricks of the trade that, anybody can do if they've done petitions before. But in terms of mistakes, kills me when they bind them and they number them first. So you're running around the office looking for page 10 It's like, what are you doing? Number them afterwards.
So there's a filing period when you have to specifically file your petitions. It's usually a 3-day window of when you can file. Most of the campaigns that I work with, I have them file on the first day. The reason why I have them file on the first day is because if someone's going to bring general objections, they need to bring it within 3 days of your filing. And so I want to make sure that that process starts immediately and that clock starts ticking. Because it's more likely than not the person who is who might be challenging you is getting their petitions ready to be filed. And so they're not thinking about your petitions just yet. So I like to start that clock. However, if a campaign is having a hard time gathering petitions, or is still under that minimum 3 times the limit level, I would suggest filing later and trying to use as much time as possible.
I always work right up till midnight. And the reason is very simple. From the moment they're submitted, the clock begins for when your opponents can look at your petitions. I do not want them to see them early. I want them to have to stand in line and get them at midnight and get copies at midnight and then go look through them. I also think that, again, it's a way to build up your volunteer base and your potential donor base and get that first voter touch to the person signing, to the signer. And the more you can do, the more you can get, the better. You know, it's not a threshold. It's not, we want 2 to 1. If you can get 6 to 1, even better. You're building your name ID. You're building your potential base.
To submit petitions to the Board of Elections, there's really 2 big things. You have to write up a cover sheet. Your cover sheet's very simple. And there's a book that the Board of Elections publishes every election season that has a sample cover sheet that is actually relatively decent. Their sample petition leaves a lot to be desired, and I would not suggest using that, but their sample cover sheet is decent. And basically what it is filling out the candidate's name, filling out the office they're running for, filling out their address that they're registered at, and then putting in the name of a contact person and how that contact person can be reached, and then filling in your individual volume numbers. You get barcodes. You have to go to the Board of Elections and receive barcodes, and the barcodes are broken up by boroughs. So you cannot mix and match barcodes. So if you're running for City Council in Brooklyn, you need Brooklyn barcodes. So filling out the cover sheet is important, and that cover sheet will be fastened, will be on top of your first volume, and it will be clocked in. And making sure everything is clocked in is important, and making sure that you get copies of everything that's clocked in. Then you're going to make your volumes, and your volumes will differ. If you have multiple petitions, so if you have a single, and you have this very long omnibus, you can't file these in the same volume. So you would file an omnibus volume, and it would have to be the same omnibus. So it's not just, oh, everything's the same long piece of paper, because a lot of times people have multiple omnibus petitions where they have different candidates on each one. So those would each get their own separate volume. Your single petition would get its own volume. Now, oftentimes, I try not to make volumes that are over about 200 pages. And the reason why is because you use, and this is the brand name, I forget, called Eco Fasteners or Echo Fasteners. And they're just binding clips to create this. And they're binding clips that have 2 holes. I forget exactly how far apart they are, but it's a standard size. And when you bind those, you don't want them to be so overburdened that they're going to burst at the seams. Remember, this is very important to you. If there is a pagination problem, the Board of Elections will contact your representative, the person, your contact representative, to tell you that there is a prima facie violation on your petitions. There are lots of prima facie violations. A lot of times they're not a big deal. A couple of years ago, Bill de Blasio got into a little bit of trouble because he had a prima facie violation on his cover sheet. And he miscounted the amount of volumes he had because he had multiple, dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of volumes around the city when he was running for public advocate, and they miscounted. And they miscounted again. And he was for a very, very short time kicked off the ballot, but was able to come back on once he went to court. But these are all curable, all these prima facie violations. These aren't violations. The Board of Elections does not count your signatures. What it does is it counts your pages. So if you need a minimum of 500 signatures and you have 10, a 10-box petition that can get 10 signatures, and you file 50 pages, technically the board will assume that you've filled every single page because they will just count them. Now, of course, you would be kicked off the ballot because there's no way you got 500 perfect signatures. But a prima facie violation would be as if you filed 49. They would go, it's impossible for you to have met the minimum requirement to get on the ballot. Or you have a problem with your pagination. And once you have a problem with your pagination, that volume, at a minimum, the pages after the pagination problem will all be invalid. There's a very simple rule that you can follow to not get yourself in trouble with fraud, and that is to not do it. And there's no reason to. Anyone who thinks any volunteer, any candidate, any campaign worker who thinks there's a way to cut corners, who goes, look, I saw an example, it was a great example of a campaign. I won't name who the candidate was, but he did stay on the ballot and he wasn't challenged. I did not work for him. But I remember I was out in a certain neighborhood, and a friend called me up and said, so-and-so has a petition, and it's at a gym, and no one's watching it. It just has a note, please sign for X. He's a good guy. And there it was, lo and behold, I went into the gym, I looked around, and it was on a table, not being watched, and had the note, please vote for X, he's a good guy. No one witnessing it. Yes, that is not good. Now, that's improper. That would not consider your petition being permeated with fraud, which is what the criteria is, that you've made a systematic fraud inside the petition, that it's assumed now that the whole entire process was fraudulent. So that would happen. Sometimes there's sometimes you have volunteers who mean very well, and they might go to you and say, Mike, you're a great candidate. I'm going to go get you 500 signatures. I'm going to do this for you. You're a great guy. And they come back a week or two later, and they have 500 signatures. And it's pretty amazing. And it kind of looks like they went door to door. And this happened actually, I've seen signatures like this. And you kind of look through them, and at first blush, they look okay. And then as you review them a little bit more, you realize that the signatures and the handwriting are in blocks. And this is kind of what people refer to colloquially as kitchen tabling. That four guys, get around on a Friday night, and they have a voter list on them, and they just sign people's name, and they pass it around. And, they pass it around once clockwise, another time counterclockwise, and then they, mix them all up. So it looks like all these different people signed it. But if you look at it carefully, you'll realize that people have, the same four people signed every single signature. If you're gathering signatures for the Democratic primary, the only signatures that will count are those of registered Democrats. Now, you should not be going out of your way to gather signatures from unregistered Democrats, but sometimes you might meet somebody on a subway platform or at a church or at a supermarket who lives in the neighborhood and lives in the district, but it doesn't remember if they're a registered Democrat or if they're a registered Republican or they're a blank. The same thing goes also, sometimes people don't know if they're in the district. And lots of districts, as all of you probably know, have very odd lines. And so you might think they're in the district, and you should get their signature, but they might not be. These are all fine. I mean, the only way it would not be fine is if you were actively looking to gather signatures from people outside of the district or who you knew were not registered.
If the candidate doesn't petition properly, there's certainly certainly the possibility of getting thrown off the ballot, and you have to assume that you're going to.
If you're running against the quote-unquote political machine or a old-time incumbent, you should consider most likely that your petitions will at least be reviewed and possibly challenged. And this is the reason why I worked for one candidate who I was convinced was going to get challenged, no matter what we did, because he was a thorn in the side of a certain political machine. And We put in some of the most immaculate petitions, I think, that have ever been filed. They were tip-top from top to bottom. And we made sure they were. And we made sure that everything was perfect. And to my surprise, we didn't get challenged. And I think the reason why we didn't get challenged was because I believe for that race we were about 6 or 7 times over the limit. There wasn't one thing out of place on our cover sheets or in our volumes, anything that they could point to. And they realized that they would lose. And so they decided not to try and not to challenge us. That being said, I worked for another candidate whose petitions again were tip-top, whose petitions were not out of place at all, who was challenged, who was charged with fraud under the false guise that about 20 or so very good volunteers couldn't have gathered a specific amount of petitions that were totally false and bogus. And that incumbent drained that candidate of a tremendous amount of money because they had to go to court. And that court case cost them a lot of money. Somebody, an actual person must challenge them. Now, it doesn't have to be your opponent. It can be somebody from the community, from the place you're running, who can challenge those petitions. And anyone can do it. They don't have to be affiliated with a campaign. Almost every single time they are affiliated with some campaign or another, but they don't have to be. And then what they would do is they would file what is called a general objection. And that's a form that when you go and get the Board of Elections form book, that's in there as well. The general objection will just object generally to a specific candidate's petitions. That will then open up another process, and I forget the exact time requirement, if it's 10 days or 7 days, for them to then file specific objections. And specific objections, it's a very arduous process. I've been involved with it on a couple of occasions. And that is actually going line by line through somebody's petitions and invalidating signatures individually. Now, this harkens back, though, to the point that I made earlier. It's very important to make sure that your people who are carrying your petitions, people who are signing the statement of witnesses, your SWs is what they call them, or registered Democrats or registered Republicans, whatever primary you're running in, and live at the addresses they say they live at. I was part of a campaign, I won't mention which one, where we knocked a person off the ballot, not because they had bad signatures. They were very close. They were not very, they were only about maybe 2 times over the limit. So we decided that we would look to see if we could challenge them. And as I was reviewing the petitions, the first thing I did was I made a list of every single one of their statement of witness, people who witnessed their petitions. And it was about 50 people. And I found about 10 or 11 people who were either not registered, because this was an independent nominating petition, it was a special election, either not registered or registered at the wrong address. This is what kicked the person off the ballot. And it was actually one person specifically who ended up causing him not to get on the ballot. And it was because of a woman who put the wrong address on. And she gathered probably about 180 signatures for him. And they were all knocked off. And, you know, that is the game. It's not always fair, it's not always right, but at the same time, we do have to have rules to be followed. And so I know a lot of candidates who I talk about wanting to change the rules. And I agree with them on almost all points, that we should have reforms and we should make sure that it's as open as possible for people to get on the ballot. But that being said, we can't change that when we're actually doing the petitioning process. So we should do it correctly. And we should follow all the rules and make sure that we're diligent in making sure that all those rules are followed.
Except for in the case of blatant fraud, as a good government group, New York Civic does not favor candidates trying to knock each other off the ballot. We think that's bad for the democratic process. But you have to be advised that many of your opponents may not share New York Civic's ideals.
I will always challenge your petition if I can. Why? Because I know the pain it took to get my candidate on the ballot, and I know the pain it takes for other candidates to get on the ballot. In all likelihood, I'm always going to challenge your petition, particularly if you're a third party. For me, it only makes sense to challenge because I know that they're going to challenge my candidate too if we haven't done, you know, the job we need to do to get them on the ballot.
When people are thinking about challenging petitions, the first thing that I say to them is I try to let's judge this practically. Let's see if this is actually even possible. Have you looked at the petitions? Usually a candidate or a campaign staffer will come in and say, oh, I looked at their petitions and they're all crummy, or I know the people who are gathering them and they're terrible, or they're not Democrats, things that they can't prove, that are totally anecdotal. So if you're thinking of challenging someone's petitions, you have to actually look at them. And what that means is you have to go to the Board of Elections, and you can either review them at their offices or get them photocopied. What I usually do is if somebody asks me to look at someone's petitions, I will review them, the actual hard copies, at the board. And if I think there's something there, I will then have them Xeroxed at the Board of Elections. You know, as a philosophical idea, should you be challenging people? That's a tougher question. You know, that's a very nuanced question. It's very hard to handle that. I generally believe that we should have requirements for things, that people should meet those minimum requirements. And so I do think at certain times, yes, it could be fair to challenge someone. I think oftentimes what people call the machine, or very, or incumbent candidates do to challenge people, is all they're trying to do is drain money from a candidate. And they're bringing a lawsuit that really has no merit, under the guise that there is some type of fraud that they think is there. And it's not. And that is unscrupulous. And I would not stand by a campaign or work for a campaign that would do that, because draining of challengers' funds just solely to drain them, I find to be undemocratic. But if there is a opponent, and a lot of times, sometimes you're running in a race against an incumbent, and there might be a third candidate who is very weak, who is not really running a serious race. And if they put in a very low limit, and their appearance on the ballot might cost you 5 or 6 points in an election, which might be the difference, you might want to think about challenging them. But I think that people should only challenge candidates when there's a credible reason to challenge them. If they really haven't met the minimum requirements, or there are actually scenarios where you can prove fraud. People should not be challenging petitions for the sake of challenging them. And oftentimes, young candidates or people who are just getting involved in politics, they want to get involved in these rough and tumble battles that they're not very aware of, and they don't really know what's going on. And just because you saw one petition being poorly witnessed, or you've heard rumors about something, does not mean that someone's getting kicked off the ballot. When they suggest the permeation of fraud, it really has to be permeated. It's not that there's one instance of a mistake or one bad apple of the bunch or one bad actor. It has to actually be permeated. And to actually knock someone off the ballot with specific objections by invalidating either individual signatures or the statement of witness is very arduous and very difficult. And anyone who says that it's easy probably hasn't done it before.
When it comes to tossing folks off the ballot, or if you will, opposing them and taking them to court and trying to challenge their petitions, 9 times out of 10 I'm going to do it. And the strategy is, do they hurt you or do they help you? And you can't just come up and say, oh, I think they help me. Yeah, everybody likes Joe Schmo. Well, if everybody likes Joe Schmo, candidate, that could mean that they like him more than they like you. I can't do that to him. Everybody likes him. Well, that's a bigger problem. If everybody likes him, they may like him more than they like you as a candidate, which means he's pulling votes from you, which means you need to go after him and kick him off the ballot. It can backfire too. It can be a strategy that you employ that removes everyone from the ballot and gives you a path to victory. I've seen that happen too. So it all depends. It all depends. Each race is different. But 9 times out of 10, I take a very hard look at those petitions, and 9 times out of 10, I'm going to try and go after you if I have something. I don't just willy-nilly go after you. You need to make sure that you have all of your ducks in a row if you're going to do this. And you have to do it to win. A candidate should be weary and understand that the media is definitely going to hit you. And they're going to hit you hard. They're going to call you undemocratic. They're going to say that, it's completely unfair that you would go after the little guy or the little girl, whoever it is. And I think the media is going to go after you because it makes it look like, the media thinks that you're now threatened and whatnot. If you have the ability to widen your base of voters, you have to do it. This is a numbers game. It's not a personality game, it's a numbers game. People don't recognize that, and the media doesn't care to recognize it. If you're cut so small as a Republican, now you've got this other person who's jumped into the race, and out of 10,000 people, you've only got about 3,000 favorable toward you. You've got to open up that group of people and that voter base. And in order to do that, you've got to fight hard, and you've got to make sure that you're successful. Only do it if you know you're going to be successful, or the risk is worth the reward. Don't get me wrong, but you've got to do it so you know that in the end, it'll likely come out your way.
Election lawyers are not always necessary. A lot of times, the first thing I hear prospective candidates go is, I got to hire my election lawyer. And they kind of walk around. There's some famous names out there, and they say, oh, I hired this guy. And usually it's a waste of money. There are a lot of people who understand this process. You do not need to be an attorney to bind signatures. You do not need to be an attorney to witness signatures. You do not need to be an attorney to do any of these things. An election lawyer is important for two reasons. A first reason, if you don't have somebody who can teach people how to petition and what the process is, there's some very good election lawyers who understand campaigns as well, who will sometimes go out and teach volunteers how to do this, and go out and teach clubs how to do this. And that's important. It's also important that the binding process. Sometimes there are people who understand the petitioning process backwards and forwards, but have no idea how to bind signatures or how to file things with the board. And that election lawyers do this quite often, and so they know that. And then most importantly, is the challenge process. Some candidates, I will suggest, a candidate who is well-financed and believes it's highly likely that they could get challenged, it might be a good idea to have an election lawyer on retainer, on a small retainer, to say, please save my spot in case, or can you just review things in a very general sense? Because lawyers are, for the most part, very expensive. So they're not going to do this day in and day out reviewing that I'm talking about. That's going to be somebody who is part of the campaign, most likely, unless that lawyer is very specifically hands-on. And some are more than others. There are some election lawyers who are fantastic, who are very hands-on, who will review things and go over things, and there are some that just aren't. And then, of course, yes, if you are taken to court or you are taking someone to court, of course you need an election lawyer. And it's very important. Election law is very specific. And so it's not something that if you are challenged, you can't just call the neighborhood lawyer, a guy who's a solo practitioner who kind of does, your generic, he does a will, he then does a divorce, he does a bankruptcy, etc. You're going to need somebody who specifically knows election law and understands it, because it is complex. And it's something that's very specific to New York, our election law at least.
We hope this episode of Candidate College answered all your questions about petitioning. Please keep in mind that Candidate College is just intended to teach you the basics. It's always important to consult with an experienced petitioning coordinator or an election attorney before embarking upon a campaign. Thanks for watching Candidate College. Good luck with your campaign.